you've heard that old statistic that says that we are 99% genetically similar to chimps?
Yes.
Well, guess what? There was a paper that came out very recently in April of this year, 2025, which found that actually we are somewhere between 14 to 15% genetically different from chimps. That old 99% statistic that we're 99% the same is no longer true.
Scientists can't ignore the intelligent design argument anymore, and it's really getting traction. Can you talk to us about what is the buzz about intelligent design within the traditional scientific community?
Yeah, so I work as the research director at Discovery Institute. And so what we're really excited about is we are seeing scientists all around the world doing research that's discovering evidence for intelligent design in nature. We're talking about looking at the amount of information that we see in DNA, or how the universe is fine-tuned for life, or how there are certain features of cells that defy a Darwinian gradual explanation, molecular machines that are incredibly complex. And so what scientists are recognizing is that there's all kinds of features in nature that can't arise through this sort of unguided Darwinian mechanism that's been around for so many years. They're realizing that that mechanism doesn't work, and they need to find better ways to explain what we see in nature.
Wow. So what I'm hearing you say is that the very theory of Darwinian evolution that we have been told is essentially fact, it's science. You know, when people say, well, I don't have faith, I'm not a faith guy, I'm a science guy, and they equate that with Darwinian evolution, you're saying the evidence actually is not backing up that theory because there's not a right mechanism or there's not a right whatever, and intelligent design is maybe a better explanation. Of course, I think it is too, but is intelligent design now a scientific theory?
Yes, absolutely. Intelligent design uses the scientific method to make its claims. And so the way intelligent design works is basically like this.
Yes.
We start by observing the kind of information and complexity that intelligent agents produce when they act. And what we find is that when intelligent agents act, they produce things like language-based code or machine-like structures. So we can then make a hypothesis that says, okay, when we look at biology, we're going to find language-based code and machine-like structures in living systems. And what they're finding is that, let's talk about proteins. Okay, what is a protein, Kirk? A protein is basically a very long chain of amino acids that is folded up into a very specific shape to form a very important function in your cells, right? So we take amino acids in our vitamins because they form the building blocks of our proteins. It turns out, and this is some of the research that intelligent design theorists are doing, that the ordering of those amino acids in proteins has to be just right. Those amino acids have to be in precisely the right order in order for proteins to be able to do their functions. In fact, one ID theorist, a protein scientist named Douglas Axe, got his PhD at Caltech. He found that for a very typical protein, the likelihood of chance generating the amino acids in just the right order for those proteins to be able to work is less than 1 in 10 to the 77th power, okay? So what we can ask is, what is generating those amino acids to be in the right order? Well, in our experience, the only kind of cause that can generate the information that we see in these proteins is an intelligent cause. So then we make a conclusion, and that conclusion is that an intelligence is the best explanation for the information that we see in living systems. And so ID is using the scientific method, it's doing research to back up our findings, and it's being done by scientists from highly credible institutions. So I think by any reasonable measure, intelligent design is a scientific theory.
Wow. I absolutely love this. I geek out on this kind of stuff. And I always want to hear what's next. So what would you say are the top lines of arguments that support intelligent design? Right now, you're talking about the fine-tuning of proteins and amino acids. What are some of the other top lines of argumentation for ID?
Sure. So I would give 3 main lines of evidence that I like to talk about as the evidence for intelligent design. The first line of evidence is that our universe had a beginning. But one of the greatest discoveries of physics and cosmology over the last 100 years is that our universe had a beginning. And if it had a beginning, that implies some super powerful first cause that exists outside of space and time to get our universe going. That's really what we would call God in many cases, right? So I think that an intelligent cause, super intelligent, outside of space and time, is the best explanation for the beginning to the universe. The next line of evidence would be the fine-tuning of the laws of nature. Again, a major discovery in physics and cosmology over the last 100 years is that the laws of nature have to have very precise values if we can live in a universe where life can exist. We're talking about things like the fundamental laws and constants of nature, like the strength of the force of gravity or the strength of the electromagnetic force. But all of the fine-tuning of nature is kind of blown away by one particular fine-tuning parameter, and that is the initial entropy of the universe. And it turns out that if you're to be able to form things like galaxies and stars and planets, the initial entropy of the universe has to be fine-tuned to within 1 part in 10 raised to the power of 10 to the 123rd power. Okay, Kirk, we can't even write out numbers like that. They're so small. If you were to try to write out that number, writing 1,000 zeros per second, you would die trillions and trillions and trillions of years before you could finish writing out that number, okay? So we're talking about some super intelligent cause has fine-tuned the laws of nature, crafted the laws of the universe. This shows an incredible amount of care and really intelligence that was necessary to create our universe. So again, this is where intelligent design comes in. I don't want to go on and on. We can talk also about the information in life. Life runs on information. That's one of the greatest discoveries of the last 50 or 60 years. Again, we have information in our DNA. But Kirk, a DNA molecule by itself is kind of like having a DVD. Remember we used to watch DVDs to watch movies? Yeah. So a DVD by itself is basically useless, right? You need some machinery to read and interpret that information, those instructions on the DVD to give you some kind of a useful output. Well, it turns out DNA is exactly the same. A DNA molecule by itself is not going to do anything for you. You need machinery in your cells to read the information on the DNA and give you some kind of useful output. So we literally have molecular machines in our cells that can read commands and codes in our DNA, interpret those instructions, and then execute them and produce the output. But where in our experience do things like computer-like code, language-based code, and then information processing to read, interpret, and execute those commands, and then machine-like structures, where in our experience do those things come from? In all of our experience, they have only one. I know. What do you think?
Intelligence.
Intelligence, exactly, Kirk. So intelligence is the best explanation for what we see at the very heart of life.
Oh, I love this. I love this. Are you loving this? Like I'm loving this? Okay, I have heard that now, today, in our lifetime, there has never been a better opportunity for intelligent design scientists to posit that the human origins line up with what we see in the Bible in the book of Genesis with Adam and Eve. Can you unpack that for us?
Sure. So I am a Christian. I do believe in Adam and Eve. I don't know if I can prove to you, scientifically that Adam and Eve existed. What I can say is that the evidence is very consistent with the biblical view that we originated from just an initial pair of two individuals, okay? So one of my favorite lines of evidence to talk about here is from the fossil record. When we look at the fossil record, we see a distinct break in the fossil record between what I would call ape-like creatures and human-like creatures. That alone shows, I think, a design event in the history of life that shows that basically we were divinely created by an intelligent cause, by God, basically, because we see the human-like body plan appearing very abruptly in the fossil record, and that is not compatible with the Darwinian explanation. It's much more compatible with intelligent design. Secondly, let's talk about human genetics, okay? You've heard that old statistic that says that we are 99% genetically similar to chimps?
Yes.
Well, guess what? There was a paper that came out very recently in April of this year, 2025, which found that actually we are somewhere between 14 to 15% genetically different from chimps. That old 99% statistic that we're 99% the same is no longer true. The true degree of genetic difference between humans and chimps is an order of magnitude greater, 10 times greater than what we've been told. It's more like 14 to 15% genetically different between humans and chimps. Then finally, think about human psychology. Sometimes we hear about this field of evolutionary psychology, which says that human behavior can be explained in evolutionary terms. But why do humans do things like building cathedrals, studying science, creating music, worshiping God? None of these very precious and cherished behaviors of human beings have any survival value if all our ancestors had to do was, basically survive and reproduce on the African savannah.
Why are they making stained glass windows and orchestras?
Why are we painting the Sistine Chapel? Why does every culture around the world, I don't care where we go, we create music, we worship divine beings? None of these traits have any survival value under basically an evolutionary worldview. So I think this shows that humans were designed for higher purposes, and we're not just around here to survive and reproduce. We're created for something greater than that.
That's right. Wow, that is fascinating. Before we go to a break, how should Christians think about origins? I know some hold a view of a relatively young Earth between 6,000, 10,000 years old, and others will hold a relatively older view of the Earth. How do you look at that subject, and does it matter?
Yeah, exactly, Kirk. I respect the fact that Christians hold different views on the topic of the age of the earth. But for me, a far more important question than the age of the earth is whether or not there is a designer and a creator behind life and the universe. If you go out and talk to your next door neighbor who's an atheist and you're trying to share your faith with them, they're not going to really care how old the earth is. Or if you say, look, I think that this is how you fit the Bible and science together, those are important questions, don't get me wrong, but they're going to say, well, I don't accept the Bible. What you can do when you're talking to your next door neighbors, you can say, look, the scientific evidence, even evidence that is accepted by mainstream science, shows a need for an intelligent cause, a creator behind life and the universe. This, I think, is the kind of evidence that your next door neighbor can accept before they're going to, get into talking about whether or not they accept the Bible. They will accept scientific evidence that shows there's evidence for life and the universe being designed by a creator.
This is so good, and this is bringing up even more questions in my mind, but I am so thankful that as a former atheist, someone was able to present the argument for intelligent design to me in such a way that helped me open up the door intellectually, where I didn't feel like I had to check my brain at the door in order to become a Christian. Okay, Casey, bottom line, are science and faith compatible? Do we have to choose one or the other, or can they be friends?
I would say that science and faith are very compatible, and in fact, they mutually reinforce one another. I'm a scientist, not a theologian, so I come at this from the scientific perspective. But I would say that what we find in nature, again, is evidence for an intelligent cause, from the microscopic, molecules that we see in our cell to the macro architecture of the universe. We are seeing evidence for design in nature. And from a Christian perspective, this is consistent with what the Bible says, Romans 1:20, which says that God is clearly seen in what has been made. I think that we find that being affirmed by science. So yeah, absolutely, science and faith are compatible.
Would you agree with me that I actually had faith as an atheist, but in the different sense? I had faith that there was no God. And now, in light of the evidence, I think it takes more faith, blind faith, to remain an atheist than it does to be a Christian. So would you agree that even secular, humanist, atheist scientists have some version of faith?
Absolutely. I mean, everybody has faith in some kind of a foundation at their worldview, okay? And you can see that in some of the answers that atheists are coming up with to respond to the arguments for intelligent design, okay? So we talked about the origin of the universe. We think that an intelligent cause, a first cause, is the best explanation, something outside of space and time that created the universe. Well, how do the atheists respond to that? They will say that the universe created itself, okay? Well, where in our experience do we see universes coming into existence on their own or matter creating itself? We have no experience with that. So this is not a good rebuttal.
You can't test it. We've never observed it. So why do you have faith in it? This year is the 100th anniversary of the Scopes trial. And just really quickly, the Scopes trial was a trial that took place in Dayton, Tennessee, 100 years ago in 1925, when there was a teacher in Dayton, Tennessee, who was accused of the crime of teaching Darwinian evolution. This was an alternative view to the origin of the universe and the planet than the biblical view. And now today, big science is now being criticized for censoring and canceling what you as a scientist and others at the Discovery Institute are positing as a better explanation for the evidence of the origins of the world. So can you give us an update on this whole subject?
Yeah, absolutely, Kirk. And I'm really glad that you brought this up, because it's important for people to understand the dynamics, sort of the power dynamics that are going on in the scientific community today to suppress the idea of intelligent design. So in the Scopes trial, as you said, what was that trial about? It was about a group of folks 100 years ago who basically tried to make it a crime to teach evolution. Now, of course, that was wrong. We should never be making it a crime to talk about a scientific theory. Even if we disagree with that idea, we should never be making it, illegal to talk about science, okay? But what we have today is what former U.S. Supreme Court Justice Scalia called Scopes in reverse, which basically we see that the pro-intelligent design viewpoint is being censored and suppressed. And so there are many cases of scientists who have been discriminated against and faced persecution because of their support for intelligent design. A very famous example was Richard Sternberg. He was at the Smithsonian Institution, and when it came out that he was a supporter of intelligent design, they basically made his life miserable, hounded him out until he was forced to resign from the Smithsonian. We even have seen speech codes being adopted at universities. At the University of Idaho, there was a biology professor named Scott Minnick who testified in favor of the constitutionality of teaching ID in public schools. And in retaliation for that, they adopted a speech code which basically said that evolution was the only view that they were going to allow in their schools. Same thing happened to Erica Dean, a former professor of physics at Ball State University. He was basically shut down from teaching an interdisciplinary class that mentioned intelligent design. And the Freedom from Religion Foundation sent a letter to their school, and they ended up adopting a speech code saying that intelligent design was not allowed in their science classes. So we've seen this this is just the tip of the iceberg, Kirk. We've seen many cases of scientists being persecuted because of their pro-ID views. And this gets back to a really much larger problem. That is the politicization of science. This has been talked about a lot in the last few years, that science has become politicized, and it is basically trying to suppress credible minority scientific viewpoints. And this is really not good for science. Science needs to allow itself to hear minority scientific viewpoints. Every single scientific revolution that has ever taken place happened because scientists were able to hear from those minority scientific views. And if minority scientific views don't have the opportunity to be heard, then new ideas can never take root or be heard in the scientific community.
That's a really, really good point. Let's talk on a very practical level for everyday guys like me, the dad, the mom, the student who would like to be able to at least have one well-rehearsed argument from science to help share their faith with a friend. What would you recommend as that entry-level argument?
Sure. I think my personal favorite argument is the information that we see in DNA. And we talked about this a little bit earlier, but what do we see at the very heart of life? We see in our DNA a language-based code. Bill Gates has said that DNA is like computer software, but far, far more advanced than any software we've ever created. The information that we see in life, the complexity of the simplest bacterial cell, Kirk, is far more complicated than any human technology we've ever devised. Cell phones don't hold a candle compared to the simplest living cell that we've discovered. So, I think that what we see in life just points that there is an incredibly intelligent creator behind life and also behind the universe.
I think it was a scientist named Berlinski who said in a documentary that I saw about the fine-tuned nature of the universe, and he was asked if in Darwin's day, when he spoke about the simple cell, if that could be equated to an Oldsmobile in terms of complexity, what do we know now about the human cell? What would you liken it to? And he said, a universe.
I think that's a very fair comparison. We're still discovering the complexity of life. And the amazing thing is that the more and more we discover about cells, about living systems, the deeper we untangle the complexity of life, the more complex it gets.
This is so exciting. We could talk for hours, but thank you so much for coming on and sharing all this with us today.
Thank you, Kirk. It was a lot of fun.